Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today at our teach-in. And we do want to stress that this is a teach-in, right? So there are many actions and activities we can participate in, rallies, protests, that type of thing. This is meant to be a teach-in where we can learn together in community. And so we're so excited to have you all here for our teach-in titled the Massacre in Gaza, Security or Genocide. And as I hope you learn as we talk here today and as our guest speaker talks with you all here today, this was a title that we chose deliberately, right? We took time to think through and choose that title based on kind of the discussions we hear currently now, right, in the public discourse. So we're very excited to have you here. The format's going to be where our speaker will, and I'll do an introduction. And introduce everyone up here as well. And then we'll speak for about 20 minutes or so, and then really wants to open it up to you all, right? To hear from you and get your questions. So we're really looking for this to be interactive. And so I'll probably be the one sprinting around with a microphone to answer those questions. So we'll do that, and for the sake of time and for everyone to be able to have the ability to speak up as they would like, we'll limit those questions and comments to 2 minutes, okay? So we will go ahead with that being said. Bathrooms, I know I always should say this, right? Especially for the public who is joining us today, members of our public, thank you so much for being here on campus with us. Straight out the doors are the bathrooms, if you are needing those, all right? Okay, so let's get started. So we have our guest speaker who has been so generous with his time to join us today. So thank you so much. Omar Badar is our guest speaker. He's a Palestinian-American political analyst and activist based in Washington, D.C. His lifelong work is dedicated to challenging U.S. policies that harm communities at home and abroad, with an emphasis on U.S. support for Israeli apartheid, which was the focus of his academic research. Omar has participated in dozens of panels, lectures, and debates on college and university campuses throughout the U.S. His media appearances include CNN, MSNBC, BBC, Al Jazeera, Sky News, Voice of America, and other outlets. And his writings have appeared in Salon, Newsweek, HuffPost, The Daily Beast, and Jadalia, among other platforms. He previously served as communications director at the Institute for Middle East Understanding, deputy director of the Arab American Institute, digital producer and presenter with Al Jazeera, and executive director at the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee of Massachusetts. So Mr. Badar is our guest speaker. On the panel, we have Dr. Ed Burns, who is a professor in the School of Social Work, Dr. Sean Chabot, professor in the Sociology and Social Justice Department, and Dr. Majid Sharifi, professor and director of International Affairs Department in the Political Science and Public Policy Department. And so with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Omar to present to you all, and then I'll be back on the mic when it's question time. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you very much for the invitation to take part in this panel. Obviously, I wish it were under better circumstances. Nonetheless, this is a very important and timely topic for us to discuss. I think that there's something paradoxical on the question of Palestine and Israel more broadly, which is that even though it is one of the most covered topics in our news, it is nonetheless one of the least understood. And that is because much of the coverage that we see on it does not adequately inform us about the issue. It is lacking in context. It is lacking in adequate humanity and basic facts that help us understand what we're actually seeing. So we end up seeing the violence day in and day out without really understanding what's the true driving force of it and what Americans can do to contribute to it actually stopping and contributing to a better future. Just to kind of give an analogy of how that might work, you can imagine a scenario in which there is an armed intruder, a group of armed intruders, 5 of them who break into a house with guns. The homeowner, to protect his family, picks up a baseball bat. They shoot and kill him. And if you were to turn on your nightly news and actually see that the story running says 5 people armed with guns and baseball bats get into a fight and one of them dies, as a matter of technicality, that is not an inaccurate accounting of what happened. But so much critical information is so missing that you basically end up coming away not having a really fundamentally basic understanding of what had actually unfolded. And that, I think, is effectively how US mainstream media covers Palestine and Israel on a regular basis. And it's, in my view, particularly scandalous because US policy on Palestine and Israel is a major moral scandal. And if Americans understood it better, they would be objecting to it and demanding a change in it much more vigorously. So before talking about the current moment in Gaza, I think it's useful to set some of this context that I think is missing. And so I'm not going to go super deep into the history, but I just want to mention a couple of kind of critical basic points in the overview of the timeline of the violence in Palestine and Israel. Starting with the fact that when Israel was created, it was created at the expense of over 700,000 Palestinians who were driven out of their homes in a campaign of ethnic cleansing to allow for a Jewish state to emerge. And Israel proceeded to destroy somewhere between 500 and 600 Palestinian towns and villages to ensure that Palestinian refugees cannot return to their homes. And this is how they can maintain a manufactured demographic majority that allows for Israel to exist as a Jewish state. And then later in 1967, Israel wages a preemptive war against its neighbors, captures the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. Now, when Israel was founded, it was founded on 78% of historic Palestine. We'll round it up to 80% just for the sake of just kind of having a basic land division. 80% was recognized as Israel by the United Nations, even though it was created at the expense of Palestinians who were pushed out of their homes. But then in 67, Israel captured the remaining 20%, which is the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And capturing those territories is considered illegal under international law. And so the UN immediately issued Resolution 242, saying that the acquisition of territory by war is inadmissible and calling on Israel to end the occupation of the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem. And a couple of decades after that, in the 1980s, Palestinians finally came around to the idea that they have to settle for a two-state solution in order to resolve the conflict. They had long been calling for a single democratic state in which the entirety of the land between the river and the sea is Palestine. By the late 80s, they look at the dynamics, at the balance of power globally, at the fact that Israel is very militarily dominant and backed by the world's only superpower. And they decide it's time for a compromise in which Palestinians settle for the occupied territories and basically cede Palestinians' right to 80% of their own land. And that kicked off the peace process with the idea that Israel was going to end the occupation, abide by its obligation under international law, to allow for a Palestinian state to exist on that 20%. And the problem here is that in spite of this massive Palestinian compromise, for the sake of reaching a peace agreement with Israel, Israel did the exact opposite throughout the peace process. Instead of ending the occupation of the Palestinian territories, Israel built more and more and more illegal settlements throughout those territories, making it impossible for a viable Palestinian state to emerge. And that's how the peace process fell apart. It was when Palestinians realized that there is no light at the end of the tunnel, that Israel is not going to allow Palestinians to exercise self-determination in any part of Palestine in any meaningful sense. So what we have right now, and kind of the reality that existed since then until today, is a reality in which Israel rules over different groups of Palestinians and denies them different levels of rights for no crime other than being Palestinian. Meanwhile, Israeli Jews have complete and total democratic rights under the state of Israel. And the only way really to describe that is that it is a system of apartheid. Some folks may be familiar with it from the South Africa apartheid era. More people might be familiar with it as the Jim Crow era here in the United States, where you have two sets of people who are being treated differently and have different sets of rights because of who they are. So Palestinians who are living in the West Bank have no rights. They don't participate, even though the Israeli government controls their lives, controls their borders, controls their ability to go from one Palestinian town to another in the occupied Palestinian territories. They don't get to participate in elections for the government that rules their lives, namely the Israeli government. Meanwhile, Israeli settlers living illegally next to Palestinians within the very same occupied West Bank have full rights under Israeli law. If a Palestinian child in the West Bank throws a rock at an Israeli tank, he gets tried under Israeli military law, and these children get tossed in prison for lengthy sentences for things that, in fact, would be defensible under international law. You are allowed to throw a rock at a foreign occupying army. And meanwhile, violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinians, far more severe, far more murderous, and it is very rare for Israelis to ever be held accountable for their violence against Palestinians, as documented by nearly every major human rights organization. You have a situation in which people within Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, those who remained within the legal borders of Israel, so to speak, who are not fully pushed out in 1948, they have second-class citizenship within Israel. They can participate in Israeli elections, but there's a giant list of laws that discriminates against them and says basically that they have less than full rights. For example, if a Palestinian citizen of Israel wanted to live in a Jewish neighborhood, there are things called housing admission committees that determine whether you are culturally, quote, culturally suitable to live in that town. It is extremely thinly veiled it's basically code for are you Jewish or are you not? Now, we're all familiar here in the United States that if you discriminate against somebody on the basis of their race or religion or ethnic background, that is transparently illegal. But in the case of Israel, the Israeli Supreme Court upheld the legitimacy of these so-called housing admissions committee that do discriminate against Palestinian citizens of Israel. There are restrictions on who Palestinians can marry when they are citizens of Israel. Any person who is Jewish can marry anybody else anywhere in the world and have them come and move and live with them in Israel. But if a Palestinian citizen of Israel marries another Palestinian from the West Bank or Gaza or from some neighboring Arab country, those people do not get to travel to Israel and get Israeli citizenship. So it is a transparently discriminatory system. And that really is the underlying reason why we have continued conflict today, is because between the river and the sea, there is only one government that rules over everyone and has any meaningful legitimacy and power to actually rule over the entire territory. And yet they rule over people with varying levels of rights. And in the case of Gaza, Gaza is actually the worst off of all the areas that are under ultimate Israeli control. Now, you'll hear a lot the claim that Israel no longer occupied Gaza, that it withdrew in 2005 and withdrew all of its settlers. That really is a misunderstanding of the meaning of the word occupation, because even though Israel withdrew settlers out of Gaza, they never ended that occupation. They completely controlled everything that goes in or comes out of Gaza. Israel prevents any Palestinians within Gaza from being able to travel abroad unless under very, very strict conditions and permits that they grant extremely rarely. So Palestinians in Gaza, before the current crisis, had been prisoners, essentially, in an open-air prison in Gaza. Gaza does not have an airport because Israel bombed the airport in Gaza and never allowed them to rebuild it. Gaza doesn't have a seaport. And so when humanitarian ships want to deliver aid to the people of Gaza, or food or medicine, the Israeli Navy blocks them. And in one particular instance, back in 2010, they actually boarded those humanitarian ships and killed activists who were on board, including one who was an American citizen. We have a situation in which Palestinians are not free. And the denial of that basic freedom is setting us up for an endless cycle of violence that can only be resolved if Palestinians were free. So if you're watching American media over the past few months, you might be under the impression that the world started on October 7th in this massive and horrifying attack that Palestinian militants launched on Israel on that day. What is missing from that conversation is the fact that on October 6th, just the day before, you had a situation in which unemployment in Gaza was over 50%, in which Palestinians were prisoners in Gaza, in which Israel could carry out military operations in Gaza whenever it felt like it, and for the preceding 17 years, had carried out many, many assaults on the Gaza Strip, killing thousands of Palestinians, including hundreds of children. And if you're just looking at the confines of last year alone, from January until October 6th, Israel had killed more than 250 Palestinians, overwhelmingly in the West Bank. And so people who call that a ceasefire are basically telling you that it is normal for Israel to deny Palestinians freedom and to kill them whenever it wants. That's the underlying assumption. If this is peace, whenever people tell you there was a ceasefire before October 7th, they are telling you that a ceasefire is a situation in which Palestinian lives don't matter so long as Israelis are safe. And that is, once again, the fundamental problem, which is Israeli occupation and apartheid, that says it is okay for Israel to deny freedom for Palestinians so long as Israelis feel safe. And we know that that's a recipe for eternal conflict, because the only way Israelis can achieve real and meaningful security is for Palestinians to also be secure and free. This is not a situation that can resolve itself in which one people gets to enjoy freedom and rights at the expense of another people. And the recipe that Israel really has presented to Palestinians is that either you put up with a situation in which you indefinitely live under Israeli control without rights, or you can leave. But if you choose to challenge us in any way, then Israel will respond with unprecedented military might, which is effectively what we're witnessing today. That even though the campaign of Israeli terrorism against Gaza in 2008 and 9 had killed 1,400 Palestinians, including more than 300 children, and even though the campaign of terrorism Israel waged in Gaza in 2014 had killed more than 2,000 Palestinians, including more than 550 children, those are considered to be the kinds of terrorism that do not merit a response because the victims are Palestinian. But the second there is a Palestinian attack of a significant magnitude against Israelis, that instantly becomes justification for the onslaught that we're witnessing today. And it started with Israeli officials referring to Palestinians as human animals. It started with the cutting off of all food and water and electricity to Gaza. It started with Israeli leaders openly using genocidal rhetoric about what's going to happen in Gaza, saying they don't care about accuracy, that they want to flatten the entire Gaza Strip. And in the case of Benjamin Netanyahu, invoking genocidal quotes from the Bible and talking about how the end result is going to be to thin out the population in Gaza. Pause and think for a moment if that rhetoric was in the other way around. If a government that was supported by the United States was talking about thinning out the Jewish population in Israel, there would rightly be massive outrage. That's an absolutely despicable thing for someone to say. But again, because this rhetoric is directed at Palestinians, it is accepted. And worse than just rhetoric is that it's actually being carried out in policy. The sheer level of death and destruction being subjected to, Palestinians in Gaza are being subjected to right now, is just off the charts. It does not compare to any other so-called war in recent memory. For context, we hear a lot in our news cycle, and we've heard a lot over the past couple of years, about how devastating Russia's campaign in Ukraine is. And I'm not taking anything away from that. It is absolutely monstrous, and it has claimed many civilian lives. The total number of Ukrainian children killed in the first year, the entire year of Russia's massive onslaught in Ukraine, is under 500 children. Still an incredibly horrifying number that we should never be comfortable with. But when you compare it to Israel killing 12,000 children in Gaza in under 4 months, we are looking at a completely different rate and scale of killing. Unprecedented level of killing of journalists in Gaza, unprecedented levels of killing of medics, unprecedented levels of killings of UN workers. On every metric that you take what is happening in Gaza, the numbers are just simply off the charts. And the level of destruction, destroying 70% of the infrastructure in Gaza, displacing 90% of the population. What we're witnessing is genocidal violence. There is no question about it. And that is why there is a case currently before the International Court of Justice that did find that Israel is plausibly guilty of genocide. It's too early to render a judgment, but the case is proceeding because South Africa submitted a plausible case and a mountain of evidence that is really difficult to dispute. forcing the court to actually entertain that possibility and to move forward and to call on Israel to immediately take measures to ensure that genocide is not being committed. And yet, Israel has not shifted its policy one bit. You have people who are currently starving to death in Gaza, including children, because Israel is preventing aid from going into the Gaza Strip. And US policy currently is one of, predictably, and used to be at least predictable before this episode, there were concerns about whether this would push it over the edge, but it clearly has not changed anything. US policy is one of unconditional military funding for Israel and unconditional diplomatic support and protection. For decades, the United States has used its veto to shield Israel from accountability at the UN Security Council more than 50 times, which, to put into perspective, from the 1970s until today, is greater than the number of all vetoes cast by all other permanent members of the UN Security Council combined on all issues for that same period. And that military funding, to the tune of $38 billion with a B every decade, and emergency funds being sent on top of it, completely unconditional, even though Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and the UN Human Rights Council, and even though Israeli human rights organizations are also saying that Israel is committing unspeakable war crimes and crimes against humanity, and is obviously openly waging a war against the civilian population in Gaza, President Biden won't budge, and that support continues unabated. And that is morally unacceptable. It is also strategically indefensible because it weakens the US posture in the world. It creates a lot of hostility towards the United States because of these monstrous policies. And it showcases US hypocrisy that we can't talk about democracy and freedom and human rights when our policy in Palestine and Israel is transparently one of supporting brutal oppression and apartheid, and in this case, growing into genocidal violence, while the US continues to bankroll it and send more and more weapons. If we want a world in which Palestinians and Israelis can experience freedom and safety, it has to be a world in which Israel is forced to see Palestinians as equal human beings who are deserving of the same rights and dignity that Israelis enjoy. And that can only happen through American accountability for Israel, because the US is the only country in the world that has meaningful leverage over Israel, given the extent of the diplomatic and military support. And this is precisely why it is critical for Americans to demand a shift in American policy, to stop treating Israel like it's a country above the law, and to insist that Israel cease its genocidal violence against Palestinian civilians in Gaza, and to start working towards a better future in which every human being living between the river and the sea can live in dignity and freedom. I will leave it at that for now, for the sake of being able to engage in the Q&A as well.
Thank you so much, Omar, for that presentation. I appreciate that. And so before the panel jumps in or jumps in with any of their comments, I wanted to see if anyone had any questions. So let's open it up to some folks in the audience for some questions or comments. Okay.
So I had a quick question. Throughout your presentation, you often talked about Israel, which is great. We need to be talking about that. Their policy isn't fantastic and can definitely be worked on. But I felt like there was a big hole, and that was why did Israel start attacking, which I think you addressed in the beginning, but I was looking through a bit of history, and something that didn't come up in this presentation was Hamas, which is currently ruling Gaza right now. And I was just wondering, what is your take on the organization Hamas? Do you think they are under the same rule as a country like Palestine? And how do you think Hamas should be worked with on a country-to-country level?
Good. I think, just for kind of a little bit more context, there was a time during the peace process when Palestinians had hope for a better future, in which support for groups like Hamas was nearly non-existent. They were committing random acts of violence that Palestinians opposed by huge numbers. There was a belief that there is a peaceful path towards Palestinian freedom. And Palestinians tried every avenue to achieve that freedom and failed. They pursued the negotiations I referenced earlier. Israel ignored those negotiations and built more and more settlements. Palestinians went to the UN to try to get accountability. The US stepped in and vetoed any accountability for Israel. They tried to go to the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court to prosecute Israeli war crimes. The US applies pressure on these institutions to stifle any accountability for Israel. Palestinians in Gaza back in 2008, was it 2008? 2018 rather, marched in something called the March for Return, protesting the blockade in Gaza, unarmed, to the fence that Israel controls, and Israeli snipers opened fire on unarmed Palestinians, killing them by the hundreds, targeting journalists and medics. And so you're looking at a situation in which no form of Palestinian peaceful resistance to Israel's occupation has yielded anything positive. And so naturally, when people have that level of frustration and despair and denial of rights, they will naturally shift in a less productive direction. And so Hamas, as a militant organization that is extreme and is promising a path towards liberation through violence, is essentially what their proposition is, they can only get support from a situation in which Palestinian despair is through the roof because there are no other avenues being provided. So from my perspective, I'm not a fan of Hamas. I had made that very, very clear many, many times. But if we're serious about defeating them, this idea that you can wage a campaign of violence against them and eradicate them is completely wrong-headed, because this kind of mass violence against Palestinians is precisely the policy that led us here. It's precisely the path that empowered organizations like Hamas. And if we're actually serious about undermining a group that ideologically is committed to mass violence as a path towards liberation, the way you defeat them is by providing Palestinians with a better path forward, by allowing them to engage in peaceful acts of protest, by not getting in the way of the campaign for boycott, divestment, and sanctions. There is this massive campaign in the United States and many other parts of the world in which Palestinians are calling for a boycott of Israel. We have laws here in the United States that stifle that essentially undermine Americans' First Amendment given right to boycott a foreign country, and say that there would be punishment in certain states if you engage in these kinds of boycotts. That is incredibly wrong-headed. We have to allow for Palestinians to resist peacefully, and we have to push for a situation in which the US should be joining and supporting and amplifying those efforts to protest Israel's illegal occupation and violence against Palestinians. And it is only in the face of Israeli intransigence and US assistance that we've put Palestinians in a situation of despair in which groups like Hamas end up building a lot more support and engage in acts of violence that are obviously distasteful.
Hi, I want to thank you for your presentation and for everyone who is here participating in this conversation. I think there's something important that has been missed as well, and it's part of what's missed in the larger cultural conversation, which is why the State of Israel is initially created and by whom. The British and the UK we are responsible in terms of what we're looking at. And I'm sorry, this is a very emotional topic for me, hope probably for many of us. But what we're looking at is forgetting the genocide that is happening, that is the Holocaust, which results in colonial establishment of the Israeli state, and that this is not something that Israelis needed, wanted either, but part of what you see is how Jewish people, and we're looking at how nationalism, religious extremism are guiding this conversation, and Israel is accountable, and there is genocide occurring in Gaza that needs to stop. But the conversation has to become much more complex than a binary conversation about Israelis and Palestinians. It's about white supremacy culture. It's about the way that has operated in relation to the creation of nation states and how that is being perpetuated. So why the US is participating in the way that they are. But if we forget why Israel is initially created as in response to the Holocaust, then we also forget that you are operating in Israel with individuals who are processing generations of trauma and also indoctrination around the fear for their own lives, which creates a violent culture, right? So fear for one's life and then the justification for violence against others. There is no justification for violence against anyone, right? Period. And so my question is how do we shift the conversation so that we understand what's actually happening around religious, political extremism and nation-state politics, and not about Palestinians and Israelis as a binary, because human beings, if we're going to succeed, we have to realize that people are fearing for their lives, and how it's playing out in relation to politics is problematic, but how we rhetorically frame this conversation is also imperative.
Thank you for that question. I think you are putting your finger on something really important. There is no denying the level of trauma that Jewish people have experienced the world over, not just from the Holocaust, by the way, but centuries of anti-Semitism that was pretty dominant in Europe at the time. And it is true that there were different visions for what kind of Jewish state might emerge and what that even means in Palestine. And it is only after the Holocaust that the more militant right-wing extreme wing of the Zionist movement that was calling for an exclusivist Jewish state that would exclude Palestinians and ethnically cleanse them to allow for the creation of a Jewish majority state where Jews can basically control their own fate and not be worried about where they are. That was a big part of it. Look, there's no denying that in principle, there is nothing wrong with the concept of a Jewish state. If any group of people has the right to self-determination and they can, if they decide to organize themselves in the form of a state, that's fine. The problem, of course, is that Palestine was not empty. There are Palestinians there. And the problem is not in the abstract with the Jewish state. The problem is with the Jewish state that was created at the expense of another people and that continues to occupy and oppress another people and deny them their basic rights. And I think that it is absolutely critical that when we talk about this, we don't frame it as Israelis versus Palestinians. I think that is correct, that misses the point. That we should be coming at this from a perspective of our common humanity. And to talk about it, when you think about the history of racial segregation in the United States, we don't talk about it as a zero-sum game conflict between white people and black people, and which side are you going to support to win and defeat the other. The idea was for a better vision in which everybody lives together with equality and justice. And I think that it's important that we talk about this issue with all the empathy in the world, with the fact that we are dealing with populations who have endured an extremely lengthy period of trauma. And that is going to take work for us to achieve a better future. But that has to be built fundamentally on the idea that all human life is equally valuable. And if there is something that is fundamentally broken right now, here for us in the United States, it is with the fact that official American policy that you see reflected in media coverage, you see it reflected in the statements of our political officials, is that life is not equally valued, is that Israeli life is more valuable than Palestinian life. It is quite transparent when you look at the numbers of Israelis who get killed and the way American politicians get amped up and Israel's right to defend itself, and you have Palestinians just as a matter of status quo being obliterated in far greater numbers. And there are no passionate speeches from American politicians about Palestinians' right to defend themselves. There is no extensive media coverage that humanizes Palestinians in the same way that you see it when it comes to covering Israelis. And I think that really is undermining a perspective that centers our shared humanity and the fact that we do have a future in which every Israeli and every Palestinian can live together in peace and safety. It just requires a completely different way of thinking than the binary that is currently being presented to us.
Question for our speaker, Omar. What do you imagine a best case peace would look like given where we are today? If you could wave a wand and create a solution, what would that look like?
Wave a wand is the critical part, right? There's what is politically realistic and feasible, which frankly right now all of it looks pretty complicated. But yes, if I could wave a wand and create the reality that I wish for, I see absolutely no reason why Palestinians and Israelis can't have access to every inch of Palestine and Israel today. From the river to the sea, this should be a place where everybody is welcome, where everybody is free, and where Palestinian refugees can also return to the towns and villages that they've come from. Obviously, in terms of the current political realities, it is difficult to imagine that future right now. And that is where the concept of a two-state compromise came from, right? It's not an ideal solution by any stretch of the imagination. The idea that you would separate people and that you would confine them to separate states and deny people the ability to go back to their ancestral homelands is not ideal, but it seemed at some point to be more politically feasible. And yet, we've created a reality right now where the extent of Israeli settlement expansion in the West Bank, the entrenchment of Israel's presence in East Jerusalem that is completely annexed at this point, makes it also very politically unlikely that we're going to see a viable Palestinian state emerge. And so I think we're back right now without a very promising political path forward in the immediate future. But nonetheless, the aspirational waving of a wand now comes a little bit closer to what might realistically be the path forward, even though it's going to take some time. And that has to be one in which apartheid ends and in which everybody just lives together with equal rights. It's, I know, a little difficult when you think of people serving in the Israeli military and people who are members of the militant group Hamas or any other. The idea that they would be living in one country or part of the same military or whatever else, it seems really fantastical at this moment. But we've seen systems of segregation and oppression break and fall apart in the past. And even though this one does feel a little bit more complicated in the meantime, I absolutely envision a future in which everybody does live together with peace, safety, and equality, where everybody can dream of a better future for their children and actually get it.
Good afternoon. I have a two-part question for Omar. What are your thoughts on the U.S. utilizing their veto power within the Security Council on the recent UN resolution on the conflict? And additionally, to what extent can the ICC case actually affect policies concerning this conflict, regardless of nation state, especially when taking into consideration, as was just demonstrated, the U.S. veto power within the Security Council?
I think the U.S. Security Council is criminal, frankly. An end to the current violence should not be a controversial proposition. We are seeing a rate of killing of children and women and innocent civilians and starvation and denial of medicine. Just the amount of the scale of human suffering unfolding right now is, again, off the charts. It's beyond imagination. And the idea that someone with a functioning moral compass can say, no, this should continue, it should not come to an end, I think is monstrous. I think that's the only way to describe what the American veto in effect is, that you see a completely fanatical Israeli government led by Prime Minister Netanyahu, but not just him. I mean, if you look at the cabinet in Israel, Itamar Ben-Gvir is part of this government. He is openly a supporter of anti-Palestinian racism and terrorism. He's been convicted of those things by an Israeli court in the past. He dressed up like Baruch Goldstein, the terrorist who broke into a mosque and killed nearly 30 Palestinian worshippers back in 1994. That's who Itamar Ben-Gvir's idol is. You have Smotrich, who openly describes himself as a fascist and who is explicitly a supporter of segregating Palestinian and Israeli maternity wards in Israeli hospitals, including for Palestinian citizens of Israel. You are dealing with a deeply racist and fundamentalist and violent Israeli government. And the idea that our own government, that Joe Biden is going to intervene to undermine an effort to put an end to that extremist government's violence against innocent civilians in Gaza, I think is a moral scandal, and I worry about what it means for the upcoming election. I worry about what it means for many, many reasons, but it is simply indefensible. The case, there are many cases before the ICC, the International Criminal Court, separate from the International Court of Justice. The current genocide case is the one before the International Court of Justice, and that one carries a lot of weight. I think it's very, very significant and meaningful because its legal findings will be binding. We will, however, as you correctly note, in terms of enforcement of any rules that come out of the ICJ, it is going to depend on the UN Security Council passing resolutions to actually enforce anything meaningful on the ground. So even though I predict that the United States will continue intervening to undermine any meaningful action, it nonetheless is significant to have a court opinion turn out that basically condemns Israeli policy and calls for its immediate end, and calls on other states to not deal with Israel or allow it to continue the current path that it does, in that it would increase the political pressure enormously on the United States and may in fact dissuade other countries that have more respect for international law than the US does to stop participating in this massacre.
This is one coming from online. It's really two questions along the same vein. How does the use of language, particularly the rhetoric surrounding violence, impact the dynamics of the Palestine-Israeli conflict? How does the choice of words, narratives, etc., contribute to the perpetuation or resolution of the ongoing tensions between Israel and Palestine?
Thank you for that question. I think language, my specialty is messaging, so I think it is absolutely very, very significant, and its impact on people's perceptions is really meaningful. And honestly, it's beyond just the choice of words. When you watch American media coverage of this issue, you see a clear contrast. You see when Israelis are interviewed about what is unfolding, there is a genuine human exchange that you're witnessing between anchors and the parents of hostages and people who have lost family members. You see a level of humanity that is perfectly deserved and appropriate, but only when you compare it to how absent it is, when you see the contrast with the way Palestinians are interviewed, with the way Palestinian deaths are being reported on simply as statistics rather than stories of human beings. When you notice the fact that in in US headlines, you very frequently have the perpetrators of violence against Palestinians missing. You will hear things about Palestinians in Gaza dying of starvation, rather than being killed by a campaign of starvation that Israel is imposing on Gaza. You see references to Palestinians dying from bullets, rather than a headline that should read, Israeli soldiers fire at civilians, XYZ. And you have this bizarre insistence on the fact that Palestinian death is always accidental and unintentional. That whenever Israelis die in Palestinian militant attacks, those are immediately covered as intentional, deliberate, monstrous, and you hear the words that accompany these kinds of acts. It's always horrific, barbaric, and whatever else. But yet, when it comes to Israeli violence against Palestinians, which again, in terms of scale, just dwarfs anything Palestinians had ever done, those words are never used, and it's always assumed as if Palestinian civilian death is collateral damage. And you would only believe that if you're starting from the fundamental inequality in the way you perceive Israelis and Palestinians, that the footage of Israeli soldiers opening sniper fire and taking out children caught on camera, or taking out a grandmother who's holding her grandson's hand while waving a white flag and gets shot in the head. We see these images, but rarely covered adequately in mainstream outlets. You have to go to social media to see these images and then wonder why you don't see it on your nightly news. And you don't see it there because it doesn't fit into a pre-imposed narrative that is supposed to treat Israel as the protagonist, Hamas as the bad guys, and the Palestinians as caught in the middle. That's the liberal end of the spectrum. You have the more vicious and right-wing narratives, ones that paint the entire Palestinian population as the enemy. But even on the liberal end of the spectrum, Palestinians are only victims of accidental violence, never the intentional targets of an Israeli policy that aims to obliterate the Palestinian population in Gaza, thin them out, as the Israeli prime minister says, and as Israeli soldiers taunt and flaunt all over social media in their acts of violence against Palestinians. Those bits are missing. And I think between that missing and the way that we talk about this issue, you do reinforce racist narratives that see Palestinians as less than, and the idea that they are less human, less compassionate, and less capable of a better and peaceful future. That's really the reality, and it's a level of racism that's going to take a lot of dedicated effort to overcome. The only promising sign, I will say, is that there is a contrast between a generational contrast in the United States, where younger people who get their access to media through social media, to the news, rather than through these mainstream legacy institutions, do tend to have a much, much better understanding of this issue. And opinion trends really reflect that. And that's why you have a lot more young people who favor a change in American policy and who do see Palestinians as human beings who deserve American support.
So I was kind of wondering, like, I guess why? Like, what's the U.S.'s motive here, other than just, I guess, ego? Because, like, if, like, just like this has been throughout multiple presidents, throughout, like, both parties, why?
There are two answers here. And this is, by the way, a topic of major debate, even within people on the camp that objects to American policy. There is a significant disagreement about what accounts for it. Two things are at play. One is the fact that the US, as part of, any powerful country, a superpower that's trying to dominate parts of the world, wants to ally itself with other powerful countries. And there are roles that different states played in the world. In the case of Israel, US military funding for Israel shot up significantly, 100-fold, after 1967, when Israel defeated Egypt, Jordan, and Syria in a matter of 6 days. That was the point at which the US decided to start significantly funding the Israeli military. And that's partly because there are strategic interests that Israel is useful can play a useful role in fulfilling. The Middle East is a very oil-rich region. The United States is interested in maintaining control of those resources, not necessarily to just take it all or anything like that, but just to maintain control over who has access. They want to dominate the region so Russia and China cannot be a more influential player in that region. And if push were to ever come to shove, the US can rely on Israel to take military action in the region to protect certain strategic interests and assets. That is one part of the equation, but the other part is the influence of the Israel lobby within the United States. Is that even though Israel is of strategic value to the US, broadly speaking, the monstrous policies towards Palestinians and this occupation that keeps getting entrenched and getting worse, that does not serve American interests by any stretch of the imagination. If anything, it would be far better for the United States if there were genuine, long-lasting peace in the region in which there isn't hostility towards Israel and the United States. That would be a more stable situation for the United States from a strictly strategic perspective. And yet the US seems unable to push us in that direction because the Israel lobby in the United States is incredibly powerful. It brags about its power. Groups like AIPAC brag effectively. There's a quote by one AIPAC official from 20 years ago or so saying, talking to a pro-Israel journalist from The Atlantic in Jeffrey Goldberg, picked up a napkin off the table and said, see this empty napkin? If you give me a day, I can come back and have the signatures of 80 senators on it. Meaning that they can basically get Congress to rubber stamp the policies that they prefer. And that is a real problem. And we find ourselves caught in a situation right now in which for an American president to challenge the Israel lobby and to insist on policies that Israel disapproves of means that they will get into a fight with a lot of members of Congress and with lobbying operations that get mobilized against them. We're witnessing that now with members of the Squad, with Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar and AOC and Jamal Bowman. There's a large list of courageous people in Congress who are insisting on policies that advance freedom and equality and human rights and of holding Israel accountable. And we are witnessing AIPAC spend millions of dollars to try to defeat them from Congress and make their battle to stay in Congress an uphill battle. Those are real factors. And you have also an old school mindset in Washington of people who have been around for a long time, who have not caught on to the changing trends in American public opinion, do not realize that a majority of Democrats today actually support withholding military funding from Israel because of its human rights violations. They're still operating in an old mindset. And even though we all understood that to be the case, it is quite shocking to witness this level of Israeli violence against Palestinians rising up to this scale and generating this much international outrage while our elected officials are choosing to stick their heads in the sand. That, I think, is yeah, it's going to take a political wake-up call and real consequences for politicians who insist on these policies, so that we can actually see that change that we desperately need.
Heo-ho, my name is Warbear. First off, thank you for coming here and educating us. I really appreciate it. The only country that I've really seen an international court of law that's been outspoken against the genocide and the violence has been South Africa. They have made it a point that they're going to judicially, put people in court that go and support Israel or fight people, citizens that are from their country. I just wanted to ask you, why do you think that is? Why do you think that there are very few number of countries that are being deliberately outspoken against these brutal acts of humanity? I've seen that among people in this area, and just people are afraid to speak out. People are afraid to call out things that are happening. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's lack of knowledge? Just they're afraid, they give in to fear, or they don't want to upset others? Or what do you see in your own life? That's what I've seen in my life. Thank you.
Thank you. To address that on both levels, the international one and domestically for that matter. Internationally, I think there are a lot of countries that are speaking up in defense of Palestinians and expressing outrage at what Israel's doing. But as you correctly noted, not many of them are willing to really step up and apply meaningful consequences for what's happening. And I think the reason behind that is because of fear of falling out of favor with the United States. The United States is an incredibly powerful country all over the world. And, if you want to have a good economy, if you want to avoid US sanctions, it pays, so to speak, to be on good terms with the United States, and taking a strong, meaningful action against Israel's violence against Palestinians and their atrocities will put you on a confrontation path with the United States, which is why even neighboring countries that are friends with the US, Jordan and Egypt, they don't like what Israel is doing in Gaza one bit. And so they criticize it very, very loudly. But when push comes to shove, they're not going to cut off diplomatic relations with Israel. They're not going to undermine Israel's economic interests. They're ultimately tied to a situation in which they have to play ball with Israel because that's the only way they can remain on the United States' good side. South Africa, among very few countries that are willing to take a courageous step, it is because South Africa has been through this history. They know what apartheid is because they've experienced it firsthand. And they also remember very well that Israel was one of the biggest supporters of the discriminatory apartheid regime that ruled over them. So they are willing to stick their necks out a little bit further, and something that I think merits applause when a country is willing to go that far and to insist on principles over interests, and to say that Palestinian human life is valuable, that we have to speak out because of that, even if there is nothing for them to benefit strategically and only a cost to pay by getting on the United States' bad side. In the case of domestically here in the US, I would just add the factor that many people are afraid to speak up because, again, the domestic Israel lobby in the United States has been absolutely vicious towards people who speak out against Israeli policies. The charge of anti-Semitism, which is incredibly serious and real, right? Anti-Semitism is a real problem, but this charge gets weaponized in the most cynical way and directed at defenders of Palestinian rights in a way to stifle conversation about what Israeli policies are, and branding anyone who tries to humanize Palestinians or defend their humanity or insist on their rights as an anti-Semite is a pretty significant disincentive for people to want to speak up because nobody wants to be branded as a racist. And my worry is that we are creating a situation in which this term loses its power when you start very, very irresponsibly directing it at defenders of human rights. You create room for real anti-Semites and real racists to operate more openly because that term loses its meaning. And I think that this is something that not just Palestinians and their allies should be concerned about, but a lot of people in the Jewish community too, who care about real anti-Semitism and who do insist on combating it, to also combat the cynical misuse of it.
Mass protests, calls to legislators, boycotts of companies that support Israel, and a current push for voting uncommitted in the Washington primary. This does not seem to move the needle. What do you see as an effective way American voters can elicit change or move the needle?
Look, in a way, I think we have already moved the needle because a majority of the American people support a ceasefire. the needle that isn't moving is one of the political establishment actually acting. And I honestly don't know what it will take for them to act. I don't know that there is a silver bullet or one thing that we can all do to ensure that they act in a better direction. But I would say that we have to keep up the pressure in every direction that we possibly can. In addition to all these actions, I would say media advocacy is important. Is that even though people who follow this issue on social media do get to see the real images of what is unfolding, we have to remember that the political class is an older generation that still relies on the corporate news to get a sense of where the American people are and what the conversation is. So from my perspective, I think as much as we should be absolutely calling legislators every single day and demanding a ceasefire and a change in American policy, we should also be calling these media outlets day in and day out, demanding that they feature American voices, Palestinian voices rather, and demanding that they feature people who are calling for a different path forward. This hoarding of one narrative on this issue is not helping anyone. We have a binary in this country in which we talk about Republicans and Democrats, right versus left, and this does not fit simply into these kinds of dichotomies that you end up excluding a huge swath of voices that ought to be talking about this. So I think that putting pressure on these outlets to feature Palestinian voices and voices of, frankly, a huge part of this movement calling for a change in policy is made up by progressive American Jews in the United States. And I think they absolutely should be part of this conversation too. Groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, and If Not Now, there is a shift within the Jewish community that you also would not notice if you're just watching corporate news, and that should be brought to the forefront. And who knows, I'm hoping it does not take an election going really badly for people to wake up. But unfortunately, things are looking pretty dire at the moment. And I think that, yeah, advocacy on every single level in every way that we can is critical, because it would not just for the lives of Palestinians, frankly, but even if we're concerned about the domestic situation in the United States, saving off a potential disaster in November, I think, calls also for a major shift in Biden's policy on this issue so that he can reclaim some of the support that has completely been destroyed in critical states like Michigan and elsewhere.
I'm wondering, what is your opinion or your analysis about the news, fairly new, about the Palestinian Authority officers resigning, since the Palestinian Authority has been such a convenient tool of Israel since Oslo, and what's behind it? I guess that's it. And also, do you think that there's any possibility that Marwan Barghouti will ever enter this picture?
Thank you. I don't think that anything significant or meaningful is going to happen on the Palestinian Authority front. Even though these resignations and whatever, symbolically, it's nice to see that people are saying this is not an untenable situation. But ultimately, this is an authority that survives because Israel allows it to survive. So it's going to be very limited legitimacy that's going to come from that authority. I do think that if Marwan Barghouti is able to get out of prison or is allowed to run for president, that could potentially be a game changer for Palestinians. He had been in prison for a very long time. He could potentially be a Mandela-like figure for Palestinians, but all of that remains incredibly uncertain, and it doesn't seem to be where Israel's natural inclination currently is. From Israel's perspective, they want to maintain a pliant Palestinian Authority that only operates within the confines that Israel allows them to, and to basically shut down the political horizon for any real Palestinian movement. So I don't see huge signs of hopes on that front just yet. Now, thank you, everyone. I'm sorry, I do have to drop off, but it's been a pleasure joining all of you, and hopefully, yeah, maybe we'll get a chance in the future.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Omar. Okay, we do have the panel members here as well, who are happy to address the questions that some of you have. We're sorry that Omar is not able to address all of the questions. Fabulous questions. Thank you so much for engaging. And if there's some folks who want to ask some of the panel members, we have folks who this is their area of expertise as well. Okay, I know you had a hand up, and then I'll come back over here. And I know we have an online one as well, right?
I'm sorry that Omar isn't able to answer this question, but I'll say this just like every day since October 7th, if the hostages were released and Hamas surrendered, there would be an immediate ceasefire. My question for him is, where's the accountability for Palestinian violence, which started way before 1948? It's documented back into the 1830s. We can talk about the Musa riots in 1920, Hebron in 1929, Tiberias in 38. How about the Palestinians inciting the Jordanian and Lebanese civil wars? It's not just violence against Jews, it's violence against Arab neighbors. Let's take a step back too. This isn't just about violence from Hamas, this is also about extremist Islam. Violence is a problem all around the Arab world. The most violent countries in the world are Muslim countries. If people talk about living in one big Palestinian state where people are going to be equal, please name one Muslim country that has democratic values. Well, this is a real issue. This is part of the issue, is to look at extremism, right? People are willing to talk about extremism in Israel. Let's talk about the bigger issue of extremism.
No. I think we should let him speak. I mean, the speaker is revealing a truth, a certain truth that is really big in mainstream media, and I like you to actually give him back the microphone and let him tell me what he means by democracy, or what he means by there are no Muslim countries that are peaceful. What does he mean by that?
Well, gay people well, or minorities well.
Okay. Can you stick to one issue so we can understand what you're saying?
You asked me what does democracy mean, and I told you it's...
Okay, does democracy to you mean a country like Israel where 20% of its population, the Arab population, under its own jurisdiction, are not allowed to go to 60% of its own property, its own proper? Is that democracy? Is that democracy where there is occupation for 75 years? Is that democracy? For 56 years, there is occupation on the West Bank and Gaza. Is there democracy? Let me see. Is there democracy? Can it be called democracy? Let's say in this country, just make one example, that the police department would attack and bomb a whole neighborhood because there are few gang members attacking something. I'm assuming, assuming that, let's say, Hamas and violence of Hamas is in fact criminal. Let's assume it. Let's assume it. If something like that happened in America, would we bomb the whole neighborhood? Do you call that democracy? Let me go to your next point. Your next point about Islamophobia, which is you seem to project some kind of Islamophobic projection. Saudi Arabia, to me, a violent, authoritarian dictatorship. Another one, United Arab Emirates. How about Bahrain? How about Kuwait? How about Egypt? We have Egyptian scholar here, right here among us, can tell us about how these governments are dictatorial. But we can maybe teach you that every one of these countries, there are dictatorship and authoritarian regime that are supported by American weapons and diplomacy and diplomatic relations. And the people of those countries, they do want democracy, but what we give them is dictatorship. So it's easy to say, it's easy to conflate any regime with its people. Here in this teaching, and Omar did such a good job, he tried not to conflate Jews with the Israeli government. But you're sitting here, you're conflating 1.4 billion Muslims with the governments, some of whom they hate more than you might hate. So let's not just go to those tropes. There are a lot to say. what you say, what you just said, if I said it about Israel and Jews, it would be called anti-Semitic. And it really would be, wouldn't it? We don't call all Jews, we don't blame Jews for what's happening with the right wing, fascist behavior, racist, apartheid, Netanyahu government. They do not represent all Jews. If you like, I can mention hundreds of Jews that think Israel is an occupying country. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, let us, Ed, you said we had another one online as well?
Is there any other way to hold Israel accountable on a global scale other than the International Court of Justice? Are there any other methods that don't rely so heavily on the United States' vote? I'm not a scholar of international affairs. I can only speak to the United States government. Oh, sorry. Is there any other way to hold Israel accountable on a global scale other than the International Court of Justice? Are there any other methods that don't rely so heavily on the United States vote?
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to keep in mind that the Palestinians have been resisting settler colonialism from the beginning, right? So there has been a lot of resistance. It doesn't only depend on the US, and it doesn't only depend on the international law, right? So if you go back into history, you see, and Omar talked about it a little bit, but if you look carefully, the Palestinians have resisted in many different ways, including armed resistance, yes, but also including almost any form of nonviolent resistance that you can imagine, right? He mentioned the Great March of Return. He mentioned, or there are other forms. The first Intifada was primarily nonviolent, involved a lot of women, especially women were in leadership, partly because a lot of the Palestinian men were in prison, especially the leaders at the time. So it's really important to see the role that Palestine plays here, and Palestinians have played. And one of the paradoxes is that probably the most oppressed part of Palestine, which is Gaza, also produced some of the most resistance. That's why there's such an attack of Israel on Gaza, because one of the ways that they want to take away their freedom is to prevent them from any form of resistance, right? But if you prevent people from resistance, whether it's verbal or collective, then that obviously is a way of dehumanizing them, first of all, but also taking away their capacity for freedom. And so then if they respond to that with some kind of violence, then we need to take responsibility for why they were put in that situation. Another important point is that Palestine is hugely influential for indigenous throughout the world. Indigenous understand what's happening in Gaza, right? Indigenous in America, that's some of the closest solidarity is between indigenous and people in Gaza. And you can look around the world. The same with African Americans, with black people seeking liberation throughout the world. In 1951, actually, African Americans went to the UN and presented documents on We Charge Genocide. This was 1951. So if you describe how they experienced genocide, initially or seemingly, perhaps not always visible through lynching, through all kinds of other ways that people's living conditions were made impossible and dehumanizing. And so that's also another reason why South Africa understands when they see genocide, when they see apartheid, when they see ethnic cleansing. So it's not just the US that we have to rely on. We have to pay attention to people throughout the world, especially through, indigenous throughout the world, now what we sometimes call the Global South. In the past, we called them the Third World. Palestine has always played a hugely important role in any kind of struggle for freedom. So what's really important is that what happens with Gaza, what happens with Palestine, is a global thing. It'll affect all of us. They're a little bit like the canary in the mine, right? What happens there and how we respond and how we dehumanize some people over other people, this is the future that we're facing if we don't respond to Gaza by freeing the Palestinians and allowing them to resist and struggle for their own freedom.
Thank you, Sean. And I think it's important also to point out that there are people around the world that are standing up and speaking out for what is happening in Palestine, right? They're attending protests and rallies and calling their representatives and engaging in boycott and divestment. So it's not just the US. Sometimes it's hard for us to look outside of our own kind of bubble and where we're at. I think it's going to take people around the world coming together to move forward on this. Do we have another online question? Okay, let's go to one more one online question, then I'll get to the folks. I see.
As we know, there is no single Palestinian experience. How important do you think it is to recognize the diversity of experiences and perspectives when talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, a framing which itself seems to indicate the existence of only two sides?
Hello? Yeah, definitely there is no homogeneity in political perspective or even demography in Palestinian. Let's focus on the political perspective. Yes, there are people in Palestine that do believe in one state, one democratic state from river to the sea, and they're one state, and they don't care what the name is. And that goes back for a long, long time. And in fact, the very idea of a state with two nations, to something like Canada, where they have, let's say, French and English as official language, and they do have that kind of nationalism, the unities and their two national identity has existed. And Hannah Arendt, a favorite scholar of mine, and a philosopher and a teacher, and a Jewish person, and somebody who was actually in concentration camps. She actually proposed that, and she didn't like the idea of a militant Zionism the way it proposed itself. But going back to Palestinian is the same thing. We do have people that do believe in a democratic state, and we do have militants who think very radical. They have actually adapted what Israel has done, militarism, through conquering, through binaries. Those binaries, at least in my opinion and the opinion of many others, are flawed, and it's between dark and light, good and evil, and those things. I mean, societies are a whole lot more complex than that. And if we just go beyond Palestine, we see the same thing in the great Jewish people of Israel. We do have right-wing, fascist-like apartheid people, but we have great scholarship coming from Israel and the Jewish people. And there are people who do not believe that in this apartheid system. We don't have really great poll on that, but some people say it's about 10 to 12% of Israelis. So neither Israel nor Palestine is a homogeneous population that do believe they're not a huge unified block of ideology that they're all the same. Things are changing, and in fact, this event that happened 4 or 5 months ago, changing Israel in its already. It is changing Israel. It's changing the world, and it has been the biggest political failure for Netanyahu and his gang.
Okay, I actually had one thing to add. Actually, because we focus a lot on Hamas, but if you look in the 60s, you had, refugees and people that had to leave Palestinian territory. They formed what's called the Palestine Liberation Organization, right? And so that organization was actually was secular. So what happened with them is they were able to bring under a coalition, started with Fatah. It involved a lot of young students, and this was the 60s, so a lot of the young students were radicalized by what happened around them in the world, including in the US. And so that's where another version of the coalition happened. And also they were the ones who ended up representing what happened with the First Intifada, right? So again, the First Intifada was very much a grassroots organization. The PLO was on the one hand part of it, but it didn't really lead it, it didn't really initiate it. So what I at least feel is one of the tragedies is that when Palestine, with the help of the US, or actually in many ways mediated, if not led by the US, got involved in the peace process, they often, they no longer really representing the Palestinian people in the same way and acting more as people who wanted to be leaders in the state. So partially because of that failure of the peace process, that's in many ways where Hamas comes from. And you see this pattern throughout history in a lot of social movements, right? If one version of a liberation organization doesn't work, then another version happens because of that. And that's where Hamas is not secular, right? In the end, it's still, as far as I know, in the last charter of 2017, it's still for an Islamic state, right? And so there's a lot of differences in how the resistance has happened, but also, again, as Omar pointed out very clearly, obviously they have a right to resist, and so if the only option available is Hamas, then that becomes, sadly, I think in some ways, it starts taking over for what the PLO tried to do before.
Okay, thank you.
So Catherine?
Yes.
I only have one more online, so take a few from the audience. And then
Take a few
circle
from
back
the
to me.
audience. Okay, hold on. All right, we've got a bunch. Okay, I know you've had your hand up for a while, and then I'll come back over here.
Thank you so much. These have been great questions. I've learned a lot already, but my question is to go back to a previous time with the Oslo Accords and a more moderate Israeli government headed by Isaac Rabin. His reward was getting shot dead by a Jewish settler physician who I believe is now in prison for life for that crime. But Isaac Rabin, I understand, had an agreement under the Oslo Accords with the Palestinian leadership for a solution. So I'd like to ask the panel, whatever happened to the Oslo Accords?
Simply, the Israeli government, both from the left and right, in fact, sabotaged it. The Oslo Accord, eventually, now we can say, at the time we were hopeful, a whole lot of people were hopeful that it was real, but it became only a performative issue to delay the peace and institutionalize the military regime in the West Bank and Gaza. That's what happened. On the left, Isaac Rabin, which we kind of glorified in this context, was the one who said, in fact, break their bones. Break their bones. That's Palestinian who protested and did it. So from then, of course, we know that the settlements in the West Bank, which is illegal, you cannot build homes on stolen lands, have expanded. And expansion has happened under both left and right. Of course, right for the last 30 years or so, is been much, much, much more powerful. So the right, we know, the right wing in Israel, we know how they sabotaged it. They never believed in two-state solution. And that goes beyond them, from Menachem Begin to Sharon, to before that, to the beginning of Israel. The whole idea was to take the whole land, an empty land, you know, for a people with no land. That goes back to 1905. The whole idea of taking this land for just one people, a land which was supposed to be a wasteland. This is the assumption of the Zionists, the military Zionists. And of course, it's not surprising that it failed, because Oslo was a performative issue. It was a show. It was fake. And we can, if we had the time, I could show through hundreds and hundreds of quotations from many, many Israeli leaders that saying in private and in public that we don't believe it. That was for the American audience.
Okay, thank you. All right, so we're going to do a question back here and then up front.
I just want to say first, thank you for your time doing this. So my question has to do with, well, a lot of times on media and through things, people talk about how it's about the hostages, but shouldn't that point be proven moot once Israeli forces killed those 3 Israeli hostages while waving white flags?
Did you get that question?
I got it. You want to answer it? Why? Well, it's a simple thing. Really, Israel does not, especially this government, since 2006, the invasion of Lebanon, they have policy on the books that do not really care about. They don't want to get into a jam of hostages versus military. And they have sacrificed hostages before. Not in public, and of course, again, we're talking about the state on one side and the society on the other side. We see there is so much opposition right now in Israel telling Netanyahu, negotiate. Let's release the hostages. And of course, Israel has hostages too, a whole lot more. All of those prisoners are Israeli hostages. But then, of course, Hamas hostages become, as this gentleman right here signified, becomes really a whole lot more, 100 or 150 of them, which is really horrible. It's criminal. But more criminal is when you have 10,000 of them. Yeah, for years and years and years, for no other reason but political reason and repression. That we don't see it, as Omar said. Okay, so but Israeli policies has been on the books. And I think you mentioned the Hebrew name for it. I just forgot the name right now earlier. That there is a policy that forget about hostages if we have to. And of course we saw that in that tragic case of 3 hostages that were killed.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Yes, I know. I'm trying to. He's had his hand up for a while.
Hio-ho. I have to go, but coming from an indigenous perspective, Palestinians, there is no other demographic on this earth that I would consider more of a relative and an ancestor and family. I'm an indigenous man, and that's how I see indigenous people, and that's how I live my life. If you're indigenous, you're family to me. That's my philosophy. We'll be speaking tonight at Spokane City Council. We'll be rallying outside between 5:30. I want to extend an open invitation to everyone in this room, and I do it with my left hand because that is the closest part to my heart, my left side. I want to invite all of you to come out to Spokane City Council and come support us and speak at open forum. And if you don't know how to do that, I'll show you. And come stand with us and rally with us, and we'll be advocating for Palestinian rights and human rights. So I want to extend that open invitation to everyone. That'll be today at 5:30 at Spokane City Council, and I'll be there. So, much.
Yes, I love that. Okay, now I have a question back. I have a question here and then a question back there.
I just wanted to ask a short question. I haven't heard anything about the evangelical Christians in the United States and their interest in the dispute.
Okay. I have not heard evangelical Christian leaders really come out loudly or heavily, but just because I haven't heard it doesn't mean it isn't going on. I do know that there's one candidate that the evangelical Christians tend to back a lot, and I want you to keep in mind that that's also the person, when they were in leadership before, moved the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So when you mentioned that group, that's one of the things I just thought about. Thank you.
This is definitely not my area of expertise, but I know there's a John Hagee, and he's an evangelical Christian, and I know, for instance, that he really supports the settler movement, right? Actually, you know, my students in my class and I, we watched a film in our class called The Settlers, and you could really see that there was actually a building that was named after him. So there's definitely a connection between, you know, evangelical Christians and the Zionist movement. I'm not going to go into theological details, but the basic idea from what I can understand is they want Jewish people to occupy Greater Israel, and they have in mind the second coming. And I'm not going to go into the details, but that's the connection. So there's a connection with Zion, with that land, right, which is obviously very holy land for many different religions. But I think that's kind of the connection between the two. I think we can go in. I don't know if you want to go into the one.
Hi, thank you for taking my question. First, do you believe that there is a diplomatic path forward for this situation? And if there is, what type of concessions beyond a ceasefire would be required to make that possible?
Yes, I think there can be a solution, diplomatic solution, but so long as, also Omar said that, so long as the Biden administration is so adamant about opposing ceasefire and long-term solution, obviously that's not real. But things are changing. I'm very hopeful. As we speak, of course, under UN and 55 countries, and that goes back to the gentleman that spoke before, that only South Africa, but 55 countries right now in front of IJ, International Court of Justice, and they're arguing to condemn Israel's occupation. And Israel occupation is illegal. And if I may have that slide, I just want to show you something. Based on international law, and international law, ironically, the United States invented it, created it to promote its own hegemony, and nevertheless, it has created its own, the life of its own, and it's really important. And I think we should have some sort of basis on which we can carry international law, and obviously, you know, the idea of accountability for everyone. So occupation under international law is illegal. Apartheid is illegal. Settlement in occupied territories in Palestine or anywhere else is illegal. De facto assertion of sovereignty over the West Bank, Gaza, East Jerusalem, and Golan Heights is illegal. All of those things are illegal. And of course, here we have, when we say diplomatic, if you have Trump was the first president who, in fact, accepted East Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. And of course, no other country in the world accept that. So when we were going back that nobody else really opposing the United States, that's not true. US is the only country that accepted that East Jerusalem was supposed to be in fact, the capital of the future Palestinian state. And this is where most Palestinian were. And that's illegal, and the United States has not recognized that. To be correct, to be proper, in fact, there is another country that agrees with the United States, and that's Fiji. And of course, Fiji, they're really afraid of the United States. So this is how it works. And even under occupation, let's just assume that occupation of Israel for its own security purposes, that it claims that it is being insecure. The Palestinians, the Jews, and the Arabs, and the Muslims want to throw all the Jews in the seas. But this phrase, you can never see any Arab, any Palestinian for sure, to say that. It's only Israeli leaders, and especially right-wing leaders, that are talking about, in fact, throwing Palestinians into the sea. And practically they have. But nevertheless, let's assume there is an occupying power and the occupation is temporarily, as Israelis claim. There is a responsibility for occupying power. And that responsibility is they can never take possession of the territory they have acquired by force. But they have. They cannot have control over it. The occupying power must not take any measures. These are codes of international. The occupant must not take any measures which might bring about permanent changes. Israelis, past 75 years, is been creating permanent changes. Israel de jure and de facto annexation of East Jerusalem and West Bank is illegal. And Israel claims sovereignty over the area, which is called Judea and Samaria, West Bank, is illegal. That is conflation of religion and politics. That's not secular. That's not democratic. Israeli establishment of 750,000 settlement in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is illegal. And the multitude of official statements that have come out from Israeli officials have been illegal. And on and on and on. Now, going back to the question, if we just focus on one issue, and one issue only, is occupation of Israel over the West Bank and Gaza, just those two problems, is it legal or illegal? If we accept that it is illegal, that it's US actually believes truly in two-state solution, then there is diplomatic solution. Because we can have two states or one state. Either one is okay. But Israel doesn't like either one of them. It does want one state without Arabs and Palestinians. If they are there, they should be in enclaves. Enclaves and controlled and subjugated to Israeli laws based on different passports, different ID cards. Right now, we have 5 different ID cards in Israel. Can you imagine that? 5 different national ID cards. Those ID cards actually determine who can go where, what they can do, what they cannot do. U.S. Hippocratic view of Israel and Palestinian is obvious. If we can bring our government to the point of accepting its own laws and rules and norms, I think we've done a good job. And that's how diplomacy opens. And there is a diplomatic, yes, I'm hopeful. Of course, the hopelessness is not so positive and productive. So we have to be hopeful. And the presence of so many people in this room shows that we should be hopeful. Things are changing.
And we'll move. Oh, did you want to speak, Shauna?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. I think another responsibility of any occupying power, as far as I know, is to take care of the people, to make sure that they can lead a decent life. And so now, especially with the ICJ saying that Israel has a responsibility to allow for humanitarian aid is a crucial, obviously has to happen first before any kind of diplomatic achievements can be brought about. And if we look at it now, this morning I heard, there's a 2-month-old baby that starved to death, right? And so there's obviously, all kinds of reports coming out today that say even if we have a ceasefire now, there's still going to be over 10,000 deaths. If there's no ceasefire, that amount could be up to 80,000 is at least the number that I heard. So obviously, unless Netanyahu, unless the Israeli government, unless Joe Biden, unless the U.S. accepts that as a premise, that otherwise we can't. All diplomacy or attempts at diplomacy are really hypocritical, as Majid said.
Thank you. And yes, I think we can go back to wrap that with what Omar had said in the beginning, right? That a military response is not going to defeat Hamas. It is not going to bring about safety. That's not going to end this, right? And so it is that diplomatic approach that needs to happen, right? Not only for a ceasefire, for humanitarian aid, for rebuilding, for ending the occupation, for all of that, because exactly that. And north of Gaza now, if you do not know, there is a famine that is happening in northern Gaza, right? The humanitarian aid, very, very little humanitarian aid is getting in. People are starving and do not have food. And so there's going to be, like you said, disease is spreading because the medical facilities have been taken out of, have been bombed, right? And so all of that is just snowballing on top of it. So there is a need for a diplomatic solution, but it needs to happen immediately. And as you can see, right, as Dr. Chabot and Dr. Sharifi mentioned, right now that's not happening. So appreciate the question. And then I know over here, I know we also have online. Can we go to one online, because we've kept them off for a while, and then we'll go over here.
Does the international community in the U.S. need to recognize Hamas as a legitimate body of Palestinian representation for negotiations for peace or a state? If not, what other parties or governing parties do the Palestinians have to refer to in engaging with Israel and the international community?
There is a saying that we sit with our enemies to negotiate, not our friends. Yes, Hamas is a political actor. Its destruction is impossible. It's an ideology. They should be on the political negotiating table. And their statement, not their original statement, but in fact their statement back in 2016 and the new constitution declares that they agree with all the other factions of Palestinians to sit on the same table and negotiate with Israel a long-term peace. And they pretty much agree with the democratic settlement of the issue by taking vote. And they came to power by electoral processes. It was sabotaged, definitely in the West Bank, but they came to power. And if we really believe in democracy, we should give them a chance. Yes, I don't personally approve everything they do, but who can? You know, that applies to US military too, right? And every other military that I know of. Hamas has a social wing, a political wing, and a military wing. And yes, definitely, the political wing of Hamas is a political actor, and they want to talk about things. So is PA, and so is all other institutions and groups that are outside. And in fact, as Omar said, properly and correctly, if in fact there is a situation, if there is a democratic situation, Hamas would lose its power. Right now, if there were election today in Gaza, after all of these bloodletting, Hamas would be elected again. So it is a political vision. When there is an actor that is bombing you, of course, you root for the militant that are standing up to it. And those militants are brothers and cousins and neighbors and people that have sacrificed themselves for a national cause. So the whole idea of branding anyone terrorism, I don't believe it. Because if we define terrorism based on the UN definition, that terrorism is an act of killing civilians for political purposes, then Israel is the biggest terrorist state in the world. So are other states, not to just single out Israel. And Hamas has done the same thing. Hamas has, in the process of its political objective, has killed civilians. And for that, I condemn it. But we have to just have some kind of a standard for making these brands. But, these brands of terrorism, therefore we don't sit with terrorists and we don't talk and we don't negotiate. These are ridiculous. Houthis were terrorists now, since a month ago, but they weren't terrorists. US put them off the list a year ago. And they were terrorists a year before that. And this goes back and forth. It shows that terrorism is a brand. It's a cliche. It doesn't mean anything. We should negotiate with people whom we may not like.
I just wanted to add that there's also a historical precedent for this, right? So if we remember, Mandela and the ANC were known Mandela was known as on the terrorist list, and the ANC was known as a terrorist organization. The same with Northern Ireland, right? So you had IRA that was also known as a terrorist organization, and in both the Northern Ireland and the South African case, it was the political wing of that organization that was able to broker peace. So there are historical precedents for this, and obviously our ways of thinking about organization shifts as history changes. Most people, when we think of Northern Ireland, we might not think about terrorism anymore, but when I was young, that was all you would hear in the news, and so you would assume nobody's going to negotiate with IRA. So I think it's a similar situation with Hamas today.
Okay, and we have a student question, so I want to go over here with the students. Hold on. Yes, I know, and I also want to give our students as well. So I see.
Hi, I'm Aubrey. Okay, I'm so sorry. It wasn't more of a question, but it was more of bringing attention to some voices. Bisan Awada, she has been posting a lot on Instagram, TikToks, if you are at all involved with that. I believe that it is incredibly important to listen to these voices, especially because we are not getting an accurate depiction of what is going on with the news outlets. And I also just wanted to share something that just happened a few hours ago, but an active duty U.S. airman set himself on fire in front of the Israel embassy in Washington, D.C., and he says, "I am an active duty member of the U.S. Air Force, and I will no longer be complicit in genocide. I'm about to engage in an extreme act of protest, but compared to what people have been experiencing in Palestine at the hands of their colonizers, it's not extreme at all. This is what our ruling class has decided will be normal. Free Palestine." And he is now dead. So I would encourage everyone to look online, find your people, find the resources, because we're not getting the information that we need to help Palestine.
Okay, now back over here, coming around the back.
Thank you for that.
Give me a minute.
I just wanted to point out also historically, this is in Tunisia, right? 2010, there was self-immolation by, what was his name again? I forget his name, but that started, what became known as the Arab Spring, right?
Okay, and I know we're getting close to time, so we'll have just a couple more questions, right? I mean, those people just want to hang out.
Well, I'm really glad to see the turnout here. So that really inspires me. I love seeing all these young people be engaged, because that really, you guys are the hope of tomorrow. My heart is a little bit breaking, though, because it feels like this is a one-sided kind of conversation, and I'm really sad that it wasn't a multiple-person panel. One's, giving voice to Israel, because as far as indigenous people conversations, I get that. But you can't dig through Israel and not get some documentation of the original people who lived there thousands of years ago. So in terms of indigenous claims, the Jews have big ones. That's why they're called Jews, is because they're from Judah. And also, as far as apartheid state, the reason that they came to Israel was because they were the pogroms across northern Africa, from Morocco, all through Spain, they were fleeing the Holocaust. They were fleeing the pogroms. All of their property was being stolen. Their children were being sent up in flames in a systematic, that's genocide. That was genocide, and they fled to come to that place. They have a right to have a place. And this is all of their weapons there, the Iron Dome is a defensive weapon. The David's sling, the arrow, they're trying to protect themselves. And they've done the peace process over and over again by trying to offer, land for peace. But the Arab League was the three no's: no recognition, no negotiation, and you guys probably, sorry, this is super stressful for me. I hate this. And even Hamas, when Israel pulled out of the Gaza Strip in 2005, there was a democratic election that Hamas won. And then they killed their opposition party. They killed the Fatah party. And they were invited to be welcomed into the economic world if they would recognize Israel as a nation, that they had a right to be a nation, that they would renounce terror, and that they would agree to revisit the armistice lines. And Hamas didn't, so Israel put that blockade up. All of those things could have been removed. The blockade was self-inflicted. Hamas has been horrible to the Palestinians. And I'm sad. Sorry, this is a question of what do you see as the peace options that the Arabs, that the Palestinians are bringing in? I know I am a minority here, so I appreciate you being respectful, and I'm also going to be at City Council tonight too. So I appreciate us all getting engaged in the conversation because we need to talk. So what are the Palestinians proposing for peace that you've seen make progress?
Thank you very much, and I empathize with your feeling, and I empathize with the feeling of all the Jews, and actually we should recognize that a huge, horrible, disastrous genocide happened in Europe. Anybody who denies it are crazy. And the fact that it happened, it was a racist, apartheid, a supremacist system that subjected Jews to that kind of horrible extermination. And definitely that happened in Europe. It happened in the heart of the Western civilization. It didn't happen in the Muslim world. It didn't happen by Palestinians. Palestinians have never done that and are not intending to do it. They don't say they want to do it. There is no claim of that. So let's remember that the pain and suffering of Jews during World War II should not be forgotten. But at the same time, the pain and suffering of Palestinians right now under occupation and bombing and starvation and sanction and all the other institutionalized, militarized systems should not be forgotten. If anybody who's got a Jewish heart and understand genocide and understand Holocaust should empathize with the plight of Palestinians. This is one thing we must say. So genocide should never happen again. Many, many people said never again, but it is happening in our eyes. So we should hold Israel accountable. This is not about Judaism or Jewish people. This is about a political, racist, apartheid system. Now, as far as recognition of Israel is concerned, at least in this teaching, nobody on this panel or our guest speaker and many, 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 many other Palestinians do not talk about not recognizing Israel. In fact, your statement is flawed. I'm sorry to correct that. The Arab League, I'm not a fan of them. It's a bunch of authoritarian regimes. But nevertheless, they're on paper saying if Israel recognized the 1967 borders, which leaves only 18% of the original Palestinian land to Palestinian, they will recognize Israel. What has Israel done that for that? So we shouldn't blame just Arab League for that, even though I'm not a fan of them. But that recognition still there. Now we just focus and signify Hamas for not recognizing Israel as a legitimate state. Israel and its government has lost its legitimacy to me to govern, especially govern Palestinian. But that's a different question. Now let's make a comparative analysis. PA recognized Israel as a sovereign state, even over them, and recognized that they have to be negotiating with them, meaning PA, Palestinian Authority, accepted recognizing Israel before even starting negotiation. What happened to them? They have become the tool of the right-wing Zionist occupation. They have become complicit in this area. Hamas didn't want to go through that subjugation. So, again, the difference between Hamas. So if Hamas doesn't recognize Israel, it shouldn't. I think Israel, the government of Israel, is an illegal state. It's illegitimate state. But now, does that mean that Israelis and the people of Israel, the people that are citizens of Israel, we should not show empathy and sympathy and write to them? Of course we do. When we say one state, from the river to the sea, one state solution. Equal rights for everyone. Why would we not recognize that? If we recognize that, of course, just like America, aren't Jews free to practice their own religion? Do we not believe in secularism? Why shouldn't we do that for Israel? Why should Israel be the only Jewish and only Jewish state? Please review the 2018 Basic Law of Israel. It's a part of its constitution. Please, it makes it to be Israel as a Jewish state and Jewish state only. That cannot be democratic. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right, we're going to do, I know we had a question up here, right? And then we have a question in the back. So we'll finish with this question, and then if folks, I know we're getting close to time, right? And so we can stay and answer your question.
I'd like to go, it's on. I'd like to go back to Palestinian resistance, not from Palestinians, but I'd like an addressing of a global resistance movement that's been in effect for many years. It's called BDS. And I would like some pros and cons and some exposure to BDS. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, BDS stands for Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions. And BDS is really based on what happened in South Africa, right? So it's really taking this very similar strategy as what happened in South Africa. And one of the things that happened is that initially the US government was ignoring, the boycotts and the sanctions against South Africa. And allowing its corporations to stay there. But eventually, partially through a lot of student protests actually in the US and also around the world, which actually included shanty towns on campuses that students would be in and obviously they would raise consciousness about that. And eventually, even the US government eventually felt the pressure, and obviously once the corporations withdrew, because a huge part of apartheid, we have to remember, has economic interests behind it. And so I think that's at least where the BDS comes from. I think the one thing that shows its threat and its power is that there are so many laws now in cities and in places around the country against it that shows kind of the danger that it poses. Another really important thing is it comes from and has the endorsement of the Palestinian civil society. So it's not a foreign invention. It's not something that only supporters of Palestine do, but it's something that Palestinian civil society in many ways wants us to do, because they know that that's one of the few ways that you can really pressure Israel actually without using weapons, right? Without using armed resistance. I'm not an expert on BDS, so I don't know exactly the details, but I do know that there are many intellectuals in the US, like for whatever reason, Naomi Klein comes to mind. There are many people who support the BDS strategy.
Ed, did you want to add just a brief, because we're gonna, yeah, and then we're gonna wrap.
One of the things that would make BDS work or not work is the level of transparency about a couple of things. Who institutions do business with, and not necessarily like I don't think we do business with military contractors, but it's looking at who do institutions do business with, and also looking very carefully at their investment portfolios. I've never asked those questions here at Eastern, but I will, just because if this is being talked about, we should do it in an informed way. But I know some institutions have been, like I was at the University of Utah during the anti-apartheid. I remember, helping put up shanties, swinging a hammer. But their administration was a bit resistant to being transparent. I don't know what would happen here at Eastern. The only other thing I just want to tell you is, that Tip O'Neill 30, 40 years ago said all politics is local. So just to give you an idea about if the topic is money, Maria Cantwell received $134,000 during the last, the 23-24 campaign cycle from pro-Israeli lobbies. And since her election in 2000, it's been about 400,000. And if you look at Patty Murray, she's received 185,000 during the 21-22 cycle, and she's received 680,000 over the course of her political career as a senator. And that comes from the Federal Elections Commission.
Okay, thank you.
I just want to say, just circle back to a previous question a little bit, and representation, equal representation, and if we are fair in this panel or not. I must answer that because first I need to say that I do agree that there should be equal representation. And I must say this, of course, in the general public, we know the mass media, we know the political government, the presidency, the office of presidency, both Republican and Democratic Party are unwavered and conditional support of unconditional support of Israel. So it should be equal. Definitely, that's a good equality. Definitely, Congress should be equal representations. Newspapers like New York Times and Washington Post should represent Palestinian plights as equal as Israel. That's a great point. CNN definitely should do that, I remember, or PBS, or all the other mass media. So there should be, I do agree with you that there should be equal representation in politics and media. I remember in PBS, in one of the broadcasts, Nick Schifrin, who's the international affairs sort of a journalist, was crying when he was interviewing, correctly and properly, I would say, and empathetically and rightly, was crying when he was interviewing the cousin of one of the hostages or one of the murdered people on October 7. But he hasn't done that since, with the 30,000 people that have died. 13,000 of them being children. He has not interviewed any one of them. He has not humanized the story of any one of them. He has not talked to parents and grandparents, let alone cousins. And he hasn't done that, and he hasn't cried. And that's really important to have that equality. For this panel, we extended offer to one of the scholars in this institution to come and take at least, in fact, my place to represent Israel. And nobody showed up. We offered. And here, I standing before you as a human being and feeling for you and empathizing with all the trauma that many, many people are going through, and yours definitely is as valid as anyone else. Let's have a pro-Israeli teaching. Just allow us to also debate the issue, rather than falling into this, oh, you're anti-Semitic, or you're anti-Israeli, or you're a terrorist, or you're a Muslim, or what about all these tropes? Let's throw away, tropes. I'm definitely ready to have a public debate on this panel about the legitimacy of governance of Israeli. Let's talk about that.
Okay. We need to, I want to recognize everyone's time, so I know it's 2 o'clock. So if you have to head out, I know Sean wants to say something, but if you have to head out, I recognize that. And we do have people who, if you want to ask questions, we are happy to stay and talk with you about that. Okay?
I just wanted to end with a very well-known poem by now. I'm sure some of you have heard of it. The title is If I Must Die. It's by Rafat Al-Arir, and he wrote this a few days before. He was a poet, and he wrote it a few days before he died on December 6th. So if I must die, you must live, to tell my story, to sell my things, to buy a piece of cloth and some strings, make it white with a long tail, so that a child somewhere in Gaza, while looking heaven in the eye, awaiting his dad who left in a blaze, and bid no one farewell, not even to his flesh, not even to himself, sees the kite, my kite you made, flying up above, and thinks for a moment an angel is there, bringing back love. If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale.
Okay, and so like I said, if folks need to head on out, that's fine. We have more questions, so I want people to be able to ask those.
Thank you so much for showing up. A couple of the things that I want to say lead to the question that I really have. I'm going to stand up so that way. There you go. Okay. So a couple of the things. I was raised in the military. And so I was raised at NASA and Edwards Air Force Base, and then I found myself in the entertainment industry for a long time. And then I found myself with the Freemasons for many decades. So indoctrinated heavily into this Zionist ideology. And the reason that I say that is because there is a real differentiation between Judaism and Zionism. And the one thing is, here in the West or in many of the cultures, we have convoluted the reality of the importance of language. And the language that we're being given to use today are by the colonizers and the imperialists that have conquered and all of that. So when I did my master's in communications here at Eastern, we talked about the value of language and having to restructure language to be able to better understand the message that's going on. The genocide that's happening today is a systematic result. It's systemic, and it's a very systematic result of a very intelligent group of people that have done many things to get it to this point. But some of the things that I had heard from people who would counter the narrative or talk about Israel in a certain way forget to include that word of Zionism as opposed to proper Judaism, because Jewish Voices for Peace, 250,000 rabbis around the world would disagree with Israel and have since the onset. Many of the people who are children, I'm Semitic. I have Arabic blood. Semitic is a derivative of a language, not a culture. And so being Islamophobia is anti-Semitic. And yet we don't talk about this in the West because it's not addressed. And because people are so afraid of becoming uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable with the status quo, you're going to veer toward what is it that's going to give me the comfort and convenience, and that's dangerous. But we're raised in a culture where the language is becoming more constricting to freedom, to democracy, to equity, to equality, to all of these things, that often when we hear these things like Hamas only came as a result of what had been happening, the constriction, that boa constrictor, when it was constricting, and the atrocities that were committed and documented by the UN in the 70s. You know, I would ask people to look, if you really want to understand possibly better what's going on, look at the Havara Agreement of 1933, August of 1933, and who the actual Zionists signed that agreement with, and why the Zionists were allowed to go to Palestine at that time, but the Jews who did not agree with Zionism weren't. There's a lot that happened in the early 1900s, long before all of this. Zionism is a new term to an old ideology, just like Freemasonry is a new term for an old ideology that has been planning and all of these things that are happening. And we're sitting at the precipice of being able to make a change in this world, but without the language to be able to support it, it's very difficult. We are arguing from their terms, their definitions, their beliefs. And so I thank you all so much, but my encouragement, how valuable to you is the language and getting the right message, the right definitions, the right understanding across so that we can make real educated decisions and counter the narratives of the Israeli, the AIPAC, this Zionist gaslighting of that, well, we're Jews and it's about the Holocaust. No, it's not, because the Zionists didn't care about the Jews that were killed anyway. And we know that from history and historical fact. So how important to you all is the narrative, and how do we change that language so we're getting a better message across to help people really see that freedom for Palestine is freedom for humanity?
Thank you for that question. Actually, it's interesting just to look at even the definition of genocide, right? The first thing we associate with it is the physical element, right? Deliberately destroying, harming, killing people in whole and in part. But actually, what actually needs to happen to prove genocide is intent. And this is exactly where the language comes in. And so that, so language can work both ways, right? So language can work in favor of violence, and I think systematic violence is not really possible without language to at least justify, at least to the people who you hope will support you. Obviously, preferably also make other people bystanders who are too afraid to challenge you, because of the language is scary. When somebody calls you anti-Semitic, and none of us want to be known as or want to see ourselves as racist, that makes you afraid. So what are you going to do? You're going to try to avoid getting into that situation, which only perpetuates and in some ways unintentionally perhaps makes you complicit. So yeah, language is crucial, but it's also important to keep in mind language is not only dangerous, it can also be liberatory. So that's why, like the poem I just read, that's language, right? And that's language that can shift your way of thinking about something. It's language that doesn't make it only about what we see in the media or the images that we see. We can understand somebody's emotion and how they can maintain hope even in the most desperate situations And even when that person knows he's probably going to die, we can draw strength from that. So yeah, language, I think, goes both ways.
I just wanted to, most of you know me because of my use of numbers, and that's who I am, but I always pay careful attention to language. And I go back to this idea of primary and secondary process. So primary process is when I say I have done this, okay? I asked Sean for the microphone. It's not that the microphone was passed to me or was given to me or I got the microphone, right? I did something active. And so when you hear me talk about the number of Palestinian civilians or children who were killed, who are injured, the number of UN aid workers who were killed, I always say who they are killed by. You know, if you listen to some of my radio show pieces, it's been killed by the Israeli Defense Forces. I didn't say they were killed or something like that, or more, even more passively, these people died. And I think it's important to use that more active primary process kind of voice when we talk about these things.
Thank you so much. Yes, I think this is a very deep conversation about the language and the use of language, and we should focus on that. But I have a suggestion that the great people here, the great tech people here, they've been here since 11 o'clock, and I think we should end this. And then they're suffering. Thank you so much for doing
Yes,
such
thank
a
you all for
great
being
job.
here.
I appreciate it. Thanks everybody for coming here. We can talk on personal level outside. We don't need to keep them here. Thank you so much.